On the evening of August 14, 2008, inside Texas's Huntsville unit, Michael Rodriguez lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 6:20 p.m., the state of Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was 45 years old, the first of 7 escaped convicts to pay the ultimate price for a crime spree that had terrorized the nation 8 years earlier. The irony was stark. Rodriguez had once been a successful businessman, a college-educated restaurant owner with a yellow Mercedes-Benz and a Rolex watch. He had seemed to embody the American dream, the son of Mexican immigrants who built a thriving enterprise through hard work and determination. Yet his pursuit of forbidden love had driven him to arrange the killing of his wife. For that betrayal, he earned a life sentence. For joining the escape, he earned a place in history. As the lethal chemicals flowed through his veins, Rodriguez whispered a final prayer. "I'm ready to go, Lord." His journey from entrepreneur to executioner's table had taken 16 years. A descent that began with lust, progressed through cold-blooded murder, and ended with the slaying of a police officer on Christmas Eve. But Rodriguez was not alone in his fall from grace. 6 other men had shared his fate as fugitives, each carrying their own catalog of horrors that had brought them to the John B. Connolly unit near Kennedy, Texas. Together, they would orchestrate the largest prison break in Texas history. A 41-day reign of terror that would claim an innocent life and make them among the most wanted criminals in America. George Rivas, the mastermind, a criminal genius whose childhood abandonment had twisted into a lifelong need for control. His teenage dreams of wearing a police badge had transformed into a career of armed robbery and kidnapping that earned him 18 consecutive life sentences. From his cell, he would plan an escape so audacious that it defied belief. Larry Harper, the military-trained rapist, an honor student whose service aspirations crumbled into a series of violent sexual assaults that terrorized El Paso. His tactical knowledge and weapons expertise would prove invaluable to the group's initial success, but his psychological demons would ultimately drive him to suicide rather than surrender. Randy Halprin, the youngest at 23. A troubled soul whose childhood abuse had manifested in an unspeakable act of violence against his 30-year sentence and desperate need for acceptance made him the perfect recruit for Rivas's conspiracy. Donald Newbury, the career criminal, a persistent robber whose decades of armed holdups had earned him the nickname the I-35 robber, and a 99-year sentence that guaranteed he would die behind bars. His criminal expertise and weapons knowledge would help turn the group into a mobile army of destruction. Patrick Murphy, the sexual predator, a man whose knife-point assault on a former classmate demonstrated a capacity for calculated cruelty. His intelligence and technical skills would make him an essential component of the escape plan, while his 50-year sentence provided the motivation to risk everything for freedom. Joseph Garcia, the convicted killer, a man whose drunken altercation had ended in Miguel Luna's death and his own life sentence. His physical strength and willingness to use violence would make him valuable muscle for the group's criminal enterprises. 7 dangerous men, each serving lengthy sentences for heinous crimes, brought together by circumstance and united by desperation. They met in the maintenance department of a maximum security prison, where their work assignments provided access to tools, building plans, and areas normally restricted to inmates. What began as casual conversations among criminals evolved into a sophisticated conspiracy that would challenge every assumption about prison security. Their individual crimes had been devastating enough. A wife murdered for insurance money, women terrorized and raped, an infant brutalized, a man stabbed to death in a barroom fight, multiple victims robbed at gunpoint. Each had destroyed lives and shattered families long before their paths converged at Connolly Unit. But together, they would become something far more dangerous than the sum of their parts. But to understand how 7 individual criminals became a coordinated killing machine, how a maximum security prison became the launching pad for the largest escape in Texas history, why their month-long flight from justice ended in a Christmas Eve murder that shocked the nation, and how their capture and execution shaped debates about crime and punishment for generations to come. We have to go back. Back to December 13, 2000. Back to the John B. Connolly unit. Back to the very beginning of the Texas 7. In fact, we go back to the part of the case not always accessible to the media. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Now, before we dive in, I want to be completely transparent with you. What you're about to watch is not your typical true crime breakdown. This isn't a surface-level retelling that skims over the details. This is the full story, told in its entirety, with every twist, every decision, every consequence laid bare. This video is going to be long, really long. We're talking about a comprehensive deep dive that covers 7 different criminal backgrounds, a meticulously planned prison break, a nationwide manhunt, and years of legal proceedings that followed. But here's what I promise you. By the time you reach the end, you'll have the most complete understanding of the Texas 7 case that exists anywhere on this platform. So grab something to drink, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most complex and devastating crime stories in American history. George Angel Rivas Jr. was born on May 6, 1970, in El Paso, Texas, into a fractured family that would set the stage for a lifetime of violence. The border city of El Paso, with its mixture of American and Mexican cultures, provided a backdrop of both opportunity and danger for children growing up in working-class neighborhoods. For George, it would become the training ground for a criminal career that would span decades and ultimately cost innocent lives. When George was just 6 years old, his parents' marriage collapsed in a bitter divorce that would define the rest of his childhood. The breakdown of his family was not gradual or amicable. It was sudden and devastating for a young boy who desperately needed stability and love. His mother and father, unable to resolve their differences and unwilling to prioritize their child's needs, made the decision to abandon their parental responsibilities entirely. George was placed in the care of his paternal grandparents, elderly people who had not expected to raise another child in their twilight years. While they provided basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing, they lacked the energy and emotional resources needed to address the psychological trauma that George was experiencing. The 6-year-old boy struggled to understand why his parents had disappeared from his life and what he had done wrong to deserve such abandonment. The absence of his parents created a wound that would never properly heal. George began to develop trust issues that would affect every relationship he formed for the rest of his life. He learned early that the people who were supposed to love and protect him could simply vanish without warning, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that felt hostile and unpredictable. His grandparents, well-meaning but overwhelmed, enrolled George in local schools where he proved to be intelligent and capable of academic success. Teachers noted that he was bright and had potential, but they also observed concerning behavioral patterns. George was withdrawn, suspicious of authority figures, and showed little interest in forming friendships with his classmates. He seemed to be building walls around himself that grew higher with each passing year. Growing up in El Paso during the 1970s and 1980s, George was exposed to the realities of border life, including smuggling, violence, and the easy availability of weapons. The city's proximity to Mexico made it a hub for illegal activities, and young people often witnessed events that would have been shocking in other communities. For George, this environment normalized violence and criminal behavior at an impressionable age. Despite the trauma and dysfunction in his personal life, George harbored dreams of becoming a police officer during his teenage years. This aspiration seemed to represent his desire for order, authority, and respect in a life that had been marked by chaos and abandonment. He imagined himself wearing a uniform, carrying a badge, and commanding the respect that had been denied to him as a powerless child. George attended Isleta High School, where his behavioral patterns became more pronounced. He was a loner who kept to himself and never participated in school activities, sports, or social events. His classmates remember him as quiet and intense, someone who seemed to be carrying invisible burdens that set him apart from his peers. Teachers described him as intelligent but disengaged, capable of excellent work when he applied himself, but often seeming distracted by internal conflicts. His fascination with weapons became evident during his high school years, when he acquired 2 dogs that he named Ruger and Beretta, after popular firearms. This choice of names was not coincidental or innocent. It reflected a growing obsession with guns and violence that was beginning to overshadow his stated desire to become a police officer. Friends and family members who noticed this pattern should have recognized it as a warning sign, but in a community where weapons were common, it was largely overlooked. The transformation from aspiring police officer to potential criminal was gradual but steady. George began to romanticize the power and control that came with carrying weapons, but his focus shifted from using that power to protect others to using it for personal gain. His abandonment issues and need for control were leading him toward a path where he would take what he wanted rather than earning it through legitimate means. 1 year after graduating from Isleta High School in 1988, George committed his first serious crimes, robbery and burglary. The decision to cross the line from law-abiding citizen to criminal was deliberate and calculated. George had studied his targets, planned his approach, and convinced himself that taking what he wanted was justified by the hardships he had endured. Having no prior criminal record worked in George's favor when he appeared before a judge for sentencing. The court, seeing a young man with no previous convictions and apparent potential for rehabilitation, showed mercy by sentencing him to 10 years of probation rather than prison time. This leniency was intended to give George a second chance to build a legitimate life, but it would prove to be a mistake that enabled his criminal career to continue. During his probation period, George made what appeared to be genuine efforts to reform his life. He enrolled as a general studies major at the University of Texas at El Paso, attending classes and maintaining the facade of someone working toward a productive future. His grandparents were hopeful that education would provide the structure and purpose that George needed to overcome his troubled past. However, George's attendance at university was more about maintaining his cover during probation than about genuine academic pursuits. He was going through the motions of being a reformed young man while internally planning his next criminal enterprises. His intelligence, which could have been channeled into legitimate success, was instead being used to develop more sophisticated approaches to robbery and theft. The combination of his abandonment issues, his intelligence, and his growing familiarity with criminal techniques was creating a dangerous individual who would soon graduate to more serious crimes. George was learning that he could manipulate the system, present false facades to authority figures, and pursue criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of rehabilitation. His desire for easy money began to outweigh any commitment to his probation requirements or educational goals. George discovered that he had a talent for planning and executing crimes, and the thrill of successful robberies was more satisfying than the slow progress of legitimate achievement. He was becoming addicted to the power and control that came with taking what he wanted through violence and intimidation. The stage was being set for an escalation in George's criminal career that would ultimately lead to multiple life sentences and his transformation into the leader of one of the most dangerous criminal gangs in American history. The abandoned 6-year-old who had dreamed of wearing a police badge was evolving into a predator who would terrorize innocent victims and ultimately cost a dedicated police officer his life. George's criminal enterprises grew increasingly sophisticated and violent throughout the early 1990s. His success with his initial robberies gave him confidence and a taste for the easy money that came from taking what belonged to others. The 10-year probation sentence that was meant to deter him from future crimes instead provided him with the freedom to plan and execute even more audacious schemes. After 3 semesters at the University of Texas at El Paso, George dropped out in the spring of 1993, abandoning any pretense of pursuing legitimate education or career goals. His focus had shifted entirely to criminal enterprises, and he began what would become a multi-state crime spree that would terrorize communities across the Southwest. George's robbery career began in earnest on October 3, 1992, when he targeted a Radio Shack in El Paso. The success of this initial crime emboldened him to continue, and just 20 days later, on October 23, 1992, he robbed a Checkers auto parts store. These early crimes established his pattern of targeting retail establishments with minimal security but substantial cash reserves. In November 1992, George expanded his operations to include sporting goods stores when he robbed an Oshman's in El Paso. This choice of target was strategic, as sporting goods stores carried not only cash, but also weapons and ammunition that would be valuable for future criminal enterprises. The robbery also demonstrated George's growing understanding of which businesses would provide the resources he needed for increasingly violent crimes. His criminal activities continued to escalate in 1993 with the robbery of a Furr's grocery store on May 12. This crime showed George's willingness to target any type of business that offered financial opportunities, regardless of the potential for civilian casualties or the impact on working families who depended on these establishments for their livelihoods. The crime that would define George's reputation and earn him his lengthy prison sentence occurred on May 25, 1993, when he led his crew in a takeover-style robbery of a Toys R Us store in El Paso. The operation demonstrated George's evolution from simple theft to sophisticated criminal enterprise. This was not a spontaneous crime, but a carefully planned assault that showed his growing expertise in controlling multiple victims and managing complex criminal operations. George and his two accomplices entered the toy store during busy shopping hours, immediately taking control of the situation through intimidation and the threat of violence. They forced employees to handcuff themselves, demonstrating George's understanding of crowd control and his ability to minimize resistance through psychological manipulation. The robbery was executed with military precision, with each team member assigned specific roles and responsibilities. George had studied the store's layout, employee procedures, and security systems before the attack. His planning included escape routes, timing considerations, and contingencies for dealing with law enforcement response. However, George's growing confidence led to a critical mistake. The crew remained in the store too long, taking time to steal additional merchandise beyond the cash they had originally targeted. This delay allowed law enforcement to respond and surround the building before the robbers could complete their escape. When El Paso police arrived at the Toys R Us, they found George and his accomplices still inside with their victims. What followed was a 3-hour standoff that demonstrated both George's determination and his refusal to surrender, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The prosecutor's later assessment that George never gives up was proven accurate during this tense confrontation. George's behavior during the standoff revealed the depth of his psychological problems and his complete disregard for the safety of innocent people. Rather than releasing the hostages and negotiating his surrender, he used the store employees as human shields while demanding impossible concessions from law enforcement. The standoff ended when tactical officers finally stormed the building and captured the robbers. George was discovered hiding in an air conditioning duct, having abandoned his accomplices and hostages in a desperate attempt to avoid capture. His choice of hiding place demonstrated both his cunning and his cowardice when faced with the consequences of his actions. The Toys R Us robbery and subsequent standoff made George notorious throughout El Paso and earned him the designation from prosecutors as one of the most dangerous men in El Paso. This reputation was based not only on his willingness to use violence, but also on his ability to plan complex crimes and his refusal to accept defeat even when cornered. Law enforcement officials suspected George of involvement in numerous other robberies throughout Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, demonstrating the interstate scope of his criminal activities. His willingness to cross state lines to commit crimes showed both his ambition and his understanding that jurisdictional boundaries could complicate law enforcement efforts to track him. During his trial for the Toys R Us robbery, disturbing additional information emerged about George's character. His half-sister testified that he had sexually abused her from the age of 6 through 16, revealing a pattern of victimization that extended beyond his robbery career to include the most vulnerable members of his own family. A court-ordered psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Richard Coons, a board-certified psychologist, provided additional insight into George's dangerous nature. Dr. Coons described George as a prolific, confident, and arrogant criminal mastermind who was physically, mentally, and morally dangerous and will continue to be so in 15 years. This assessment proved to be prophetic, as George would indeed continue his criminal career from within the prison system. The courts, recognizing the severity of George's crimes and his complete lack of remorse or potential for rehabilitation, sentenced him to multiple life terms. His final tally included 13 counts of aggravated kidnapping with a deadly weapon, 4 counts of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, and 1 count of burglary of a habitation. These convictions resulted in 18 consecutive terms of 15 years to life in prison, ensuring that George would likely never be released through normal legal processes. Before his criminal career, George had worked legitimate jobs as a clerk, cook, and laborer, demonstrating that he possessed the skills necessary for honest employment. However, his preference for the excitement and easy money of criminal enterprises had overwhelmed any commitment to lawful behavior. When George arrived at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Connolly Unit near Kennedy, Texas, he was already planning his next escape. Prison was not the end of his criminal career, but simply a new environment in which to operate. His reputation as a dangerous and intelligent criminal preceded him, attracting the attention of other inmates who shared his desire for freedom at any cost. Within the prison walls, George began to establish the network of relationships that would eventually become the Texas Seven. His charisma and criminal expertise made him a natural leader among inmates who were facing lengthy sentences and had little hope of legitimate release. George offered them something that the prison system could not: a detailed plan for escape and the promise of freedom, regardless of the cost to innocent people. The men who would join George's escape plot each brought their own criminal skills and, more crucially, desperate motivations to the conspiracy. Among them was a former teacher from San Antonio whose respectable facade had hidden a capacity for cold-blooded murder that even exceeded George's own brutality, his name Michael Rodriguez. Michael Anthony Rodriguez was born on October 29, 1962 in San Antonio, Texas, into a middle-class Mexican-American family that valued education, achievement, and Catholic traditions. Unlike many of his future criminal associates, who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, Michael enjoyed a privileged upbringing that should have set him on a path toward success and respectability. His early life was marked by opportunities and advantages that most children could only dream of. Michael's parents, Raul and Patsy Rodriguez, owned their own business and were able to provide their son with educational opportunities that reflected their aspirations for his future. They enrolled him in Central Catholic Marianist High School, an exclusive college preparatory institution in San Antonio that had been educating young men in the Catholic tradition since 1852. The school was known for its rigorous academic standards, emphasis on character development, and preparation of students for leadership roles in society. Central Catholic was a school for boys from diverse backgrounds, but its students were generally from families that could afford private education and held high expectations for their children's futures. At Central Catholic, Michael was known as a bright and ambitious student who seemed destined for great things. His teachers and classmates saw him as someone with significant potential, though there were subtle warning signs that would only become clear in retrospect. Despite the school's emphasis on moral development and character formation, Michael began to develop attitudes and behaviors that would later manifest as a complete disregard for human life. Ironically, one of Michael's classmates at Central Catholic would later become the detective who investigated his wife's murder and helped send him to prison. This connection highlighted the stark contrast between the different paths that two young men from similar backgrounds could take, one choosing law enforcement and public service, the other choosing crime and violence. During his defense in later legal proceedings, Michael's attorneys would claim that he had been sexually abused by a teacher at Central Catholic, allegations that were part of their strategy to explain his subsequent criminal behavior. They argued that this abuse, combined with his struggle to hide his homosexuality in a rigid Catholic family environment, had contributed to his psychological problems and violent tendencies. The defense team claimed that Michael had grown up in a family that rejected homosexuality and that his attraction to other men, particularly his later relationship with George Rivas in prison, had created internal conflicts that drove him to commit crimes. However, these claims were met with skepticism from prosecutors and victims' families, who argued that many people overcome difficult circumstances without resorting to murder. After graduating from Central Catholic, Michael enrolled in teacher training classes at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, now known as Texas State University. His goal was to become an educator, a noble profession that would allow him to shape young minds and contribute positively to society. During his college years, he appeared to be following the path that his parents and teachers had envisioned for him. However, even while pursuing his education degree, Michael was developing a dual life that would eventually lead to his downfall. While studying to become a teacher during the day, he was also working part-time at a local Taco Bell restaurant, where he demonstrated the work ethic and financial discipline that would later help him achieve his entrepreneurial dreams. Michael saved his money diligently, setting aside funds toward his ultimate goal of opening his own Mexican restaurant. His plan was methodical and realistic. Work hard, save money, and gradually build the capital necessary to start a legitimate business. This combination of education and practical work experience seemed to position him perfectly for a successful future. After saving $9,000 through his work at Taco Bell, Michael approached his father, Teresa Rodriguez, for a $15,000 loan to complete the financing for his restaurant venture. Raul, who owned his own convenience store and understood the challenges of running a small business, was pleased to see his son's entrepreneurial spirit and agreed to provide the loan. With $24,000 in startup capital, Michael opened Taco House on San Pedro Avenue in San Antonio. The restaurant became an almost instant success, demonstrating Michael's business acumen and understanding of the local market. He dressed fashionably, wore expensive jewelry, including a Rolex watch, and drove around town in a distinctive yellow classic Mercedes-Benz that became a symbol of his prosperity. Michael's lifestyle during this period was a far cry from the working-class backgrounds of many of his future criminal associates. It was during his college years that Michael met Teresa Sanchez at a neighborhood swimming pool in the Inspiration Hills area of San Antonio. Teresa was a beautiful young woman with long, dark hair and an engaging smile that attracted the attention of many young men. She had graduated from Ursuline Academy, a prestigious Catholic school for girls, and was studying marketing at St. Mary's University while working part-time as an insurance agent for USAA. Teresa came from a close-knit Catholic family where she was the oldest of 6 children. Her parents, Eddie and Susie Sanchez, had raised their daughter to be responsible, caring, and family-oriented. Teresa was known for volunteering to help her mother babysit her younger siblings and for picking up food for her father after his workday ended. She was described by everyone who knew her as genuinely kind and generous. Michael and Teresa's first date was not particularly successful. His car broke down during their outing, and they lost touch for several years afterward. However, fate brought them back together when Teresa was attending St. Mary's University and Michael was taking business classes at the same institution. Their relationship blossomed during this time, and they began planning a future together. Both sets of parents had reservations about the relationship, though for different reasons. Michael's mother wanted her son to become a doctor, and felt that marriage might interfere with his professional ambitions. Susie Sanchez, Teresa's mother, had an intuitive dislike of Michael that she never fully articulated, but that would prove to be prophetic. Despite never openly expressing her concerns, Susie's maternal instincts detected something troubling about her daughter's boyfriend. The couple briefly called off their engagement due to family pressure and their own doubts about the relationship. However, in 1985, after the Sanchez family returned from a vacation, Michael appeared at their door with flowers in hand, ready to resume the relationship. His persistence and apparent devotion convinced Teresa and her family to give the relationship another chance. Michael and Teresa's wedding in 1985 was a grand affair at St. Luke's Catholic Church in San Antonio. Teresa wore a white gown with a veil that extended feet behind her, and over 1,000 people attended the celebration. The ceremony represented the union of two successful young people with bright futures ahead of them. Michael was 23 years old and owned a thriving restaurant, while Teresa was 22 and had a promising career in insurance. The early years of their marriage appeared successful by all outward measures. Michael's restaurant continued to prosper, and Teresa advanced in her career at USAA. They were regular attendees at family gatherings and seemed to have achieved the American dream of prosperity through hard work and education. Their comfortable lifestyle included the yellow Mercedes and other symbols of financial success. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage, Michael was developing dissatisfaction. As the years passed, he began to express complaints about Teresa to his brother Mark, focusing particularly on her weight gain after their marriage. These complaints revealed a superficial and controlling aspect of Michael's personality that contradicted his public image as a devoted husband. Michael's dissatisfaction with his marriage coincided with his decision to pursue additional education. In the early 1990s, he began taking education courses at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, apparently rekindling his earlier interest in becoming a teacher. However, this return to the university environment would expose him to temptations that would destroy his marriage and cost Teresa her life. At the university, Michael became infatuated with a younger female student, an attraction that completely consumed his thoughts and planning. Rather than addressing his marital problems through honest communication or counseling, Michael began to fantasize about eliminating Teresa so that he could pursue a relationship with his college infatuation. Michael's approach to this new relationship was characterized by elaborate deception. He wrote letters to the young woman describing himself as a lonely widower, a lie that revealed both his intent to murder Teresa and his willingness to manipulate others for personal gain. This deception demonstrated that Michael was already planning his wife's death while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. The financial motive for Teresa's murder was substantial and carefully planned. Teresa had 2 life insurance policies worth $150,000 each, with Michael listed as the sole beneficiary. The total death benefit of $300,000 represented a significant sum that would allow Michael to start a new life with his college girlfriend while maintaining his comfortable lifestyle. Michael enlisted the help of his brother Mark Rodriguez, who was involved in low-level cocaine dealing and constantly needed money. Mark agreed to help arrange Teresa's murder in exchange for $50,000 of the insurance money, which he planned to use to expand his drug trade. The brothers' conspiracy demonstrated how family relationships could be corrupted by greed and criminal ambition. The murder plot also involved hiring Rolando Ruiz, a 20-year-old ex-convict who had recently been released from jail on robbery charges. Ruiz needed money and agreed to kill Teresa for $2,000, a shockingly small amount for taking a human life. The low price reflected both Ruiz's desperation and the brothers' callous view of Teresa's worth. The initial plan called for the murder to occur at Macaroni's restaurant, where Ruiz would be waiting to shoot Teresa as she and Michael arrived for dinner. However, Ruiz backed out at the last minute because he had not expected security guards to be present at the location. Several other attempts also failed due to various complications, forcing the conspirators to revise their plan repeatedly. Eventually, the three men decided to commit the murder at Michael and Teresa's home, timing it for when the couple returned from an evening out. On the night of October 14, 1992, Michael took Teresa to see The Prince of Tides, a romantic drama starring Nick Nolte and Barbra Streisand. The choice of a romantic movie for their final evening together demonstrated Michael's complete emotional detachment from his wife and the horror he was about to inflict. As Michael pulled their yellow Mercedes-Benz into the garage of their home, Ruiz emerged from his hiding place and approached the passenger side of the vehicle. As Teresa opened the door to exit the car, Ruiz placed a .357 Magnum revolver against her head and fired once. The shot killed her almost instantly, ending the life of a young woman who had never harmed anyone and who had been looking forward to building a future with the man who had arranged her death. Michael's reaction to his wife's murder was carefully orchestrated to deflect suspicion. He sobbed uncontrollably and provided conflicting descriptions of the shooter to police investigators. While Mark told police that the suspect was black, Michael claimed he was Hispanic. These inconsistencies, combined with Michael's knowledge of the insurance policies and his suspicious behavior, quickly made him a prime suspect. The investigation revealed additional evidence of Michael's planning and deception. Just before Teresa's death, he had applied for an additional $150,000 life insurance policy for her, which would have brought the total death benefit to $450,000. This timing demonstrated his premeditation and his intent to maximize the financial benefit from his wife's murder. Police also discovered that Michael had been conducting an affair with the college student and had been telling people that he was planning significant changes in his life. His behavior after Teresa's death was particularly damning. Rather than grieving like a devoted husband, he went out drinking with friends on the night of her funeral, showing a callous disregard for his wife's death and the grief of her family. Teresa's funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, reflecting the impact she had made on her community and the love that her family and friends felt for her. The massive turnout also highlighted the contrast between the positive life she had lived and the evil that had been done to her by the man who should have protected her above all others. 3 days after the funeral, police arrested Michael, Mark, and their accomplices for Teresa's murder. The arrests came after Ruiz was apprehended and provided a full confession implicating the Rodriguez brothers. The investigation also revealed that Ruiz's mother had become suspicious of her son's sudden wealth and had kicked him out of the house, leading to his eventual capture. During his trial for Teresa's murder, Michael's true character was fully exposed. The prosecution demonstrated that he had meticulously planned his wife's death, deceived multiple people to accomplish his goals, and shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The evidence included his correspondence with the college student, his insurance applications, and witness testimony about his behavior before and after the murder. Michael Rodriguez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His brother Mark received a similar sentence, while Ruiz and other accomplices also received significant prison terms. The sentences reflected the court's recognition that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated murder motivated by greed and selfishness. However, Michael's story was far from over. Prison would not contain his criminal ambitions, and he would soon become involved in an even more audacious criminal enterprise. His intelligence, criminal experience, and complete lack of conscience would make him a valuable member of George Rivas's escape conspiracy, setting the stage for one of the most notorious prison breaks in American history. But Rodriguez was not the only dangerous mind within the walls of Connolly Unit. The mastermind behind the brewing conspiracy had identified another recruit whose background seemed to defy explanation. A man whose military heritage and academic achievements masked a capacity for violence that would prove essential to their plans. His name, Larry Harper. Larry Harper was born on September 10, 1963, in Danville, Illinois, into a family where military service wasn't just a tradition, it was an expectation. His father, a highly decorated command sergeant major who had served with distinction in the Army's Special Forces during Vietnam, cast a long shadow over his son's life. Growing up in the shadow of his father's distinguished military career, Larry felt immense pressure to follow in those footsteps. He was an honor student who appeared mild-mannered and well-groomed, traits that masked the psychological turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Despite his academic achievements, Larry struggled with feelings of abandonment and inadequacy stemming from his father's frequent absences. Larry's pursuit of military excellence led him to the prestigious Kemper Military School in Boonville, Missouri, where he earned an associate's degree in military science. He joined the Army Reserve and completed both airborne and infantry training. He even participated informally in Green Beret training exercises, desperately trying to match his father's accomplishments. However, Larry fell short of his own expectations and those set by his father's legacy. In 1986, Larry enrolled at the University of Texas at El Paso, majoring in marketing while maintaining his military aspirations. He worked as a substitute teacher and held a part-time job as a bookstore clerk while carrying a full course load. His professors and employers viewed him as responsible and dedicated. Until 1993, Larry had never been in trouble with the law and maintained his status as an honor student. The turning point in Larry's life came in late 1993 when he broke up with his girlfriend and began drinking heavily. The relationship's end triggered a psychological breakdown that would have devastating consequences for innocent women in the El Paso area. Alcohol abuse created a dangerous individual capable of extreme violence. Larry's first known rape occurred on September 3, 1993, near the university campus. His method was consistent and terrifying. He would surprise women at their homes, tie them up, and repeatedly assault them over several hours. All of his victims lived near the University of Texas at El Paso, where he continued his studies even as he committed these horrific crimes. Between 1993 and 1994, Larry committed a series of violent rapes that terrorized the local community. Each attack was carefully planned and executed with military precision. He studied his victims' routines, waited for opportunities when they would be alone, and struck without warning. The attacks were not random. They were the calculated actions of a predator who used his intelligence and training to devastating effect. What made Larry's crimes particularly disturbing was the contrast between his public persona and his private actions. During the day, he attended classes, worked with children as a substitute teacher, and maintained his honor student status. At night, he transformed into a violent sexual predator who showed no mercy to his victims. Larry's victims described him as cold and methodical during the attacks. He would tie them up with materials he brought with him, assault them repeatedly, and then disappear into the night. The psychological trauma he inflicted extended far beyond the physical violence, as his victims lived in constant fear that he might return. Unlike many criminals who deny their actions, Larry eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated sexual assault. During his court proceedings, he repeatedly apologized to his victims and took full responsibility for his crimes. To those present, he appeared genuinely remorseful, though this contrition emerged only after capture and conviction. His 50-year sentence meant he would likely die in prison, a reality that made him receptive to any alternative, no matter how dangerous. The conspiracy gaining momentum within Connolly Unit would soon attract another broken soul, though his path to maximum security had begun decades earlier with a childhood that read like a catalog of institutional failures. Randy Ethan Halprin entered the world on September 13, 1977, in McKinney. His biological parents had created not a home, but a battlefield, where violence and neglect replaced the love and protection every child deserves. The systematic abuse inflicted on Randy and his younger brother Wesley was so extreme that it eventually drew the attention of authorities. In 1983, when Randy was only 6 years old, Child Protective Services finally intervened. Social workers removed both boys from their biological parents, recognizing that leaving them in such an environment would likely result in permanent psychological damage. Or worse. The intervention came not a moment too soon, but for Randy, the rescue arrived too late to prevent the deep psychological wounds that would shape the rest of his life. The boy who entered foster care carried invisible scars that no amount of subsequent kindness could fully heal. The foundation years that should have taught him trust, empathy, and appropriate social behavior had instead been filled with trauma that would manifest years later in ways that horrified even seasoned law enforcement officers. By the time Randy reached adulthood, the damaged child had become something far more dangerous. A young man whose capacity for violence would eventually earn him a cell at Connolly Unit and a place in George Rivas's deadly conspiracy. The Halprin brothers were initially placed in temporary foster homes, while social workers searched for a permanent solution. Fortune seemed to smile on the boys when Daniel and Patricia Halprin, a kind-hearted couple from Dalworthington Gardens who owned an electronics business, decided to adopt them. Randy showed early promise as an intelligent and capable child. His adoptive parents provided him with stability, education, and opportunities that his biological parents had never offered. For several years, it appeared that love and proper care might overcome the trauma of his early childhood. Randy adapted well to his new family and seemed to be thriving in his new environment. However, by age 13, Randy began exhibiting concerning behavioral problems that suggested deeper psychological issues. One of the most significant problems, according to a police official, was that he thought aliens were going to be landing. He took maps, marked landing sites, and so forth. Despite these delusions, those around him noted that he wasn't unintelligent. Randy's adoptive parents, concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior, enrolled him in a boarding school in Kentucky, hoping that a structured environment might help him overcome his psychological problems. Initially, Randy appeared to adapt well to boarding school life. A dean at the school recalled that Randy didn't seem to be a bad kid. His grades were mostly above average. However, Randy's behavior at boarding school gradually deteriorated. He was caught in inappropriate situations, including being found in the girls' bathroom with a female student. In another incident, he escaped from his dormitory by tying sheets together and climbing out the window, despite the fact that he could have simply walked out the front door. The turning point came during Christmas break in 1995, when Randy stayed at the home of another student in Lexington. During this visit, he was caught shoplifting, which resulted in his placement on school probation. Rather than learning from this consequence, Randy's behavior worsened. He carved his name and a girl's name into new wooden benches at the school, leading to his expulsion. When the school contacted Randy's adoptive father to arrange for his return home, Daniel Halprin delivered devastating news. He couldn't come home. He was through with him. The rejection by his adoptive father, coming after years of trying to help Randy, represented another profound abandonment in his young life. Despite their frustration, the Halprins could not completely abandon Randy. They helped him secure an apartment in Kentucky and provided financial assistance to help him get back on his feet. However, Randy's problems were too deep to be solved with money and housing. Instead of using the assistance responsibly, he cashed the rent checks and used the money for other purposes. Randy eventually found himself living on the streets, moving from place to place and relying on social services for survival. He returned to Texas and began staying at a homeless shelter in Fort Worth, where his life would take an even darker turn. The combination of his traumatic early childhood, his psychological problems, and his pattern of abandonment had created a deeply troubled young man. At the homeless shelter, Randy met a woman with an infant child. They became acquainted with other residents and eventually pooled their limited resources to move into an apartment on Fort Worth's west side. For Randy, who had never shown any interest in children, this living arrangement would prove disastrous. Randy quickly discovered that he did not like children and had no patience for the normal behaviors of infants. The woman's baby, like all babies, would cry when hungry tired or uncomfortable. These normal infant behaviors increasingly irritated Randy, who had no understanding of child development or appropriate care techniques. On a day in August 1996, the baby's crying reached a breaking point for Randy. Unable to tolerate the sound any longer and lacking any appropriate coping mechanisms, Randy repeatedly beat the helpless infant. The violence was extreme and sustained, resulting in devastating injuries that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When paramedics examined the child, they discovered the full extent of Randy's brutality. He suffered broken arms and legs, multiple skull fractures, a black eye, and a ruptured eardrum. The injuries were so severe that they left the child permanently disabled. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the horror of what he had done, Randy pleaded guilty to causing serious bodily injury to a child. At age 19, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Donald Keith Newbury, who later became the fifth member of the group, another crime brought him in contact with the Texas Seven. Donald's criminal career would be firmly rooted in Texas. From his earliest recorded offense in 1981, Donald displayed a pattern of behavior that law enforcement officials would come to know all too well. He was a robber who never seemed to learn from his mistakes or the consequences of his actions. Donald's criminal record in Texas dated back to 1981, when he was first imprisoned for armed robbery in Austin. Even in his first major crime, Donald showed the trademark behavior that would define his entire criminal career. He used a firearm to intimidate his victims and took their money with seeming indifference to their fear and trauma. After serving only a few years of his initial sentence, Donald was granted parole, a decision that would prove to be a mistake. Rather than using his freedom as an opportunity to build a legitimate life, Donald returned to the streets of Austin and resumed his criminal activities. In 1987, he was convicted of armed robbery for the second time, also in Austin, establishing a clear pattern of recidivism. During his time on the streets between his first and second convictions, Donald was the prime suspect in approximately 12 other armed robberies in the Austin area in 1986 and 1987. The variety of his targets showed his opportunistic nature. 3 involved hotels, 1 was the robbery of a cab driver, 2 targeted surplus stores, and another involved a Trailways bus. His willingness to rob such diverse targets demonstrated both his desperation for money and his complete disregard for public safety. Following his release from his second prison term in the early 1990s, Donald appeared to make an effort to change his life. He met a woman and moved in with her and her 2 children in a rural area outside Austin. Those who knew him during this period described him as likable and noted that he was good to the woman and her children. Donald was also unusual among career criminals in that he did not drink alcohol or use drugs. Despite these positive changes in his personal life, Donald could not overcome his compulsion to commit robberies. The pattern that would eventually earn Donald the nickname the I-35 robber began on July 18, 1997. On that day, Donald walked into a La Quinta Inn just off Interstate 35 in Austin, wielding a sawed-off shotgun. He approached the desk clerk and demanded money, making off with only $65 in cash. As he prepared to leave, Donald told the clerk, "You were lucky," before running from the scene. This robbery was part of a string of similar crimes that Donald committed along the I-35 corridor. His method was consistent. He would target businesses near the interstate, use a firearm to intimidate employees, take whatever cash was available, and then flee quickly to avoid capture. The interstate location allowed him to travel between jurisdictions, making it more difficult for police to track his movements. Law enforcement agencies recognized the pattern and began working together to capture the I-35 robber. The La Quinta Inn had surveillance cameras that captured Donald's image during the robbery. Police released segments of the tape to the public, hoping that someone would recognize the perpetrator and provide information leading to his arrest. The publicity campaign worked faster than expected. Donald's 99-year sentence for his final robbery conviction meant that he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Unlike some of his fellow inmates who harbored hopes of eventual parole or sentence reduction, Donald faced the reality that he would die behind bars unless he took drastic action to change his circumstances. Among the 7 escapees, Donald had the longest and most consistent criminal record. His pattern of armed robberies spanning nearly 2 decades made him, in many ways, the most predictable member of the group. While others had committed more serious individual crimes, Donald's persistence and consistency in his criminal behavior marked him as someone who would likely never be successfully rehabilitated within the prison system. This extensive criminal history would make Donald a valuable member of the escape plan. His experience with weapons, his knowledge of criminal tactics, and his understanding of law enforcement procedures would all contribute to the initial success of the Texas Seven's break for freedom. The last 2 members of the dreaded Texas Seven are Patrick Murphy Jr. and Joseph Garcia. Patrick's crime involved a 23-year-old woman whom he had known since high school, making his assault particularly disturbing as it represented a betrayal of trust. He broke into her home while she was vulnerable, put a knife to her throat, and covered her head with a pillowcase to increase her psychological trauma while preventing clear identification. After cutting off her nightgown with the knife, Patrick raped his victim while she remained blindfolded and under constant threat of death. The timing was especially troubling. Just 3 days before committing the sexual assault, Patrick had pleaded guilty to a burglary charge, showing an escalating pattern of criminal behavior and complete disregard for legal consequences. Joseph Garcia's crime happened in 1996. Unlike some of his future accomplices, whose crimes were carefully planned, Joseph's path to murder began with a spontaneous confrontation that escalated beyond control. These 7 men, each carrying the weight of violent crimes and facing decades or lifetimes behind bars, would eventually find themselves housed within the same maximum security facility. Their individual paths of destruction had led them to the same destination, the John B. Connolly Unit near Kennedy, Texas, where the state confined its most dangerous criminals. Here, among concrete walls and razor wire, men whose severely battered lifestyles had destroyed innocent lives would discover they shared more than just violent histories. In this unit, George Rivas commanded respect within the prison population. His reputation as an escape artist and his dramatic 3-hour standoff with police at the Toys R Us store had established him as someone who would never accept confinement quietly. Facing multiple life sentences, George possessed both the criminal intelligence and leadership qualities that naturally drew other inmates seeking alternatives to dying behind bars. The maintenance department at Connolly Unit became the epicenter of conspiracy. Most of the 7 conspirators found themselves assigned to maintenance work, providing them with unprecedented access to the prison's infrastructure. While other inmates remained confined to cells and common areas, the maintenance crew moved freely throughout the facility, studying security procedures, guard rotations, and structural vulnerabilities. Each conspirator brought essential skills to the group. Michael Rodriguez contributed business planning expertise from his restaurant ownership background, serving multiple life sentences for his wife's murder. Larry Harper provided military training and weapons knowledge from his Army Reserve Service, facing 50 years for serial rape. Joseph Garcia offered physical intimidation and violent capability, condemned to life for murder. Donald Newbury brought decades of armed robbery experience and criminal expertise, sentenced to 99 years. Randy Halprin, the youngest at 23, had demonstrated violence against an infant and sought acceptance within the group during his 30-year term. Patrick Murphy added intelligence and technical skills while serving 50 years for aggravated sexual assault. The months of working together in the maintenance department created opportunities for extensive planning and intelligence gathering. The conspirators studied every aspect of the prison's operations, memorizing guard schedules, security protocols, and emergency procedures. Their legitimate work assignments provided perfect cover for reconnaissance activities that would have been impossible for ordinary inmates. By late 2000, months of planning and preparation had transformed 7 individual inmates into a coordinated criminal enterprise. They had studied their target extensively, identified its weaknesses, and developed a sophisticated plan to exploit those vulnerabilities. Each member understood his role in the operation and had accepted the risks involved. December 13, 2000, dawned like any other day at the John B. Connolly unit. George Rivas had been developing the escape plan for months, studying every aspect of the prison's operations with the attention to detail of a military strategist. His intelligence and criminal experience made him uniquely qualified to identify weaknesses in the facility's security protocols. Unlike previous escape attempts that relied on luck or desperation, George's plan was methodical and comprehensive. The timing of the escape was crucial to its success. George had identified that the period between 11 a.m. and noon represented the prison's most vulnerable time. During this window, many inmates were at lunch while others were being counted, creating what prison officials called the slowest period of the day. This timing meant that certain areas, particularly the maintenance department where 6 of the 7 conspirators worked, would have minimal supervision. The maintenance department location was no accident. George had specifically arranged for his co-conspirators to be assigned to jobs that would place them in the same area at the same time. Patrick Machigemba, the civilian supervisor who oversaw the maintenance department, had no idea that the inmates under his supervision were planning to use their work assignments as the launching point for the largest prison break in Texas history. George's recruitment of his fellow escapees was as carefully planned as every other aspect of the operation. Each man brought specific skills and experience that would contribute to the plan's success. Michael Rodriguez provided sophistication and connections outside the prison. Donald Newbury contributed extensive criminal experience and knowledge of weapons. Larry Harper offered military training and tactical expertise. Joseph Garcia and Randy Halprin, while younger and less experienced than some of the others, possessed the physical capability and willingness to use violence that would be necessary during the escape. Patrick Murphy, though not assigned to the maintenance department, was strategically positioned to assist once the plan was set in motion. If you've been following the story up to this point, make sure you're subscribed to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth, real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. We break these stories down to the smallest details so you can see the whole picture and draw your own conclusions. Hit that subscribe button, drop your location in the comments, and let's continue. At approximately 11:20 a.m. on December 13th, the plan was set into motion with military precision. The 7 men began by overpowering 9 civilian maintenance supervisors, including Mochigemba, who were caught completely off guard by the sudden attack. The civilians had no reason to suspect that the inmates they supervised daily were capable of such coordinated violence. The inmates also subdued 4 correctional officers who were in the area, along with 3 uninvolved inmates who had the misfortune of being present when the escape began. The attackers used improvised weapons, including sharpened metal objects called shanks, to intimidate their victims and ensure compliance. Michael Rodriguez, in particular, was noted for his viciousness during this phase of the escape. He would put these shanks in people's ears while they were being tied up, making threats. This level of brutality ensured that the victims would not resist or attempt to sound alarms. The escapees bound and gagged their victims, then dragged them into an electrical room where they would not be discovered immediately. This gave the conspirators precious time to complete the next phases of their plan without fear of interruption. The victims were left unconscious and secured. With their immediate area secured, the escapees quickly changed into civilian clothing that belonged to their victims. This disguise was crucial to the plan's success, as it would allow them to move through the prison without immediately attracting attention from guards or surveillance cameras. The group then broke into the prison armory, a heavily secured area that contained an extensive collection of weapons and ammunition. Their ability to access this facility demonstrated both the sophistication of their planning and the extent to which they had studied the prison's security systems. They stole 14 handguns, 1 shotgun, an AR-15 rifle, and more than 100 rounds of ammunition. Armed with this substantial arsenal, the escapees approached the prison's guard tower, where they surprised 2 guards who were completely unprepared for such a coordinated assault. The guards were quickly overpowered and tied up, giving the escapees control of a critical security checkpoint. The final phase of the escape involved commandeering a white prison pickup truck that had been modified with a false bottom for transporting contraband. The vehicle provided perfect cover for their escape, as it appeared to be an official prison vehicle that would not attract attention from outside observers. As the escapees drove away from the Connolly unit, they left behind an ominous note that would haunt law enforcement for weeks to come. "You haven't heard the last of us yet." This message demonstrated their confidence in their plan and their intention to continue their criminal activities as fugitives. The white pickup truck carrying the 7 escapees sped away from the Connolly unit with its cargo of desperate men who had just achieved what many considered impossible. Behind them lay unconscious guards and civilian workers who would not be discovered for precious minutes. That could mean the difference between freedom and recapture. Ahead lay a carefully planned route that would take them far from the prison before authorities even realized what had happened. George Rivas sat behind the wheel, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The escape had gone exactly according to plan, a testament to months of careful preparation and intelligence gathering. Every contingency had been considered, every possible failure point addressed. Now they were free. But freedom was just the beginning of their challenges. The drive to the Walmart parking lot in Kennedy took only minutes, but those minutes felt like hours to the escapees. Every approaching vehicle could be law enforcement. Every siren in the distance could signal the beginning of their pursuit. However, their disguises as civilian workers and their use of an official prison vehicle provided perfect camouflage during these crucial early moments. At the Walmart, the escapees quickly transferred from the prison pickup to a second vehicle that had been positioned there by Teresa Rodriguez, Michael's father. This vehicle switch was another crucial element of George's plan, designed to delay pursuit and confuse investigators about their direction of travel. The prison truck would be discovered quickly, but by then they would be miles away in a vehicle that authorities had no reason to suspect. Teresa Rodriguez's participation in the escape plot demonstrated the extensive planning that had gone into the operation. His willingness to assist his son and the other escapees by providing transportation showed that the conspiracy extended beyond the prison walls. This outside assistance was crucial to the plan's success. With their escape vehicle secured, the 7 men had to make immediate decisions about their next moves. They had achieved their primary objective of breaking out of prison, but now they faced the challenge of remaining free while heavily armed and extremely dangerous. Their stolen arsenal made them capable of devastating violence, but it also made them prime targets for every law enforcement agency in Texas. George's plan called for the group to split up eventually, but for now they needed to stay together to maximize their resources and capabilities. The escapees' first priority was putting distance between themselves and the prison. They drove north toward San Antonio, following routes that George had studied extensively during his planning. His choice of direction was deliberate. Rather than heading toward Mexico as many escapees might, they would go in an unexpected direction that would confuse their pursuers. In San Antonio, the group briefly considered their options. They had money from the commissary accounts they had been able to access before the escape, but those funds would not last long. They needed additional resources to support themselves as fugitives, and they needed them quickly. George's criminal experience told him that they would have to commit robberies to finance their time on the run. The decision to begin committing robberies immediately after their escape was both predictable and dangerous. While they needed money to survive as fugitives, Each crime they committed would provide law enforcement with additional evidence and opportunities to track them down. However, their need for resources outweighed their concerns about additional exposure. Their first target was a Radio Shack in Pearland, Texas, in the greater Houston area. The choice of target reflected George's understanding of retail security and cash handling procedures. Radio Shack stores typically had minimal security but carried significant amounts of cash, making them ideal targets for quick robberies. The Radio Shack robbery was executed with the same precision that had characterized their prison break. The escapees entered the store armed and immediately took control of the situation. They bound the employees and stole cash, along with police radio scanners that would prove invaluable for monitoring law enforcement communications during their flight. The police scanners represented another example of George's strategic thinking. By monitoring police frequencies, the escapees could stay ahead of law enforcement efforts to track them. They would know when roadblocks were being established, when search areas were being expanded, and when investigators were closing in on their location. Following the Radio Shack robbery, the group continued their movement through Texas, staying ahead of the rapidly expanding search effort. News of their escape was spreading quickly through law enforcement channels, and soon every police agency in the state would be looking for them. The escapees needed to get out of Texas as quickly as possible. However, George's plan called for one more major score before they left the state. Christmas Eve was approaching, and holiday shopping meant that retail stores would have maximum cash on hand. This represented an opportunity for a significant robbery that could provide enough money to support the group for months of hiding. The target George selected was an Oshman's sporting goods store in Irving, Texas. The location was ideal for several reasons. Sporting goods stores carried valuable merchandise that could be easily sold. They typically had large amounts of cash from holiday sales, and they often had minimal security staff during busy shopping periods. George's plan called for them to steal money, weapons, and anything else of value, then disappear completely from Texas. They would establish new identities, find safe locations to hide, and begin new lives far from the reach of Texas law enforcement. The escapees spent several days in the Dallas-Fort Worth area preparing for the Oshman's robbery. 4 of them checked into an Econo Lodge motel in Farmers Branch under assumed names, maintaining the low profile that had kept them free since their escape. They studied the target location, planned their approach, and prepared for what they expected to be their final crime in Texas. As Christmas Eve approached, the 7 escapees were confident in their abilities and optimistic about their chances of remaining free indefinitely. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold across the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, with thousands of families preparing for holiday celebrations. Last-minute shoppers crowded into stores seeking final gifts, while families like the Hawkins gathered for traditional holiday meals. For most people, December 24th represented joy, togetherness, and anticipation of Christmas morning. For 7 fugitives hiding in a Dallas suburb, it represented opportunity. George's plan for the Oshman's robbery was elaborate and carefully choreographed. Rather than simply entering the store with guns and demanding money, the escapees would pose as security personnel investigating a theft at another location. This deception would allow them to gain the trust of store employees and gather everyone in one location before revealing their true intentions. The plan called for 6 of the 7 escapees to enter the store just before closing time, when customer traffic would be minimal and employee numbers would be reduced. George Rivas and Larry Harper would pose as Oshman's security guards, investigating a reported theft at another store. Joseph Garcia, Randy Halprin, Donald Newbury, and Michael Rodriguez would pose as their assistants, gathering evidence and interviewing employees. Patrick Murphy would remain outside in a stolen Ford Explorer, serving as lookout and monitoring police radio frequencies with the scanners they had stolen during their earlier robbery. His position would allow him to warn the others if law enforcement approached the scene and ensure that their escape route remained clear. The deception was sophisticated enough to fool experienced retail employees who were accustomed to security investigations. George and Larry had prepared convincing stories about investigating theft rings that operated between multiple Oshman's locations. They would request that all employees be gathered together to view photographs of suspected thieves, a reasonable request that would place everyone in a controlled location. As the other escapees positioned themselves around the store collecting merchandise, George and Larry would maintain the illusion of a legitimate security investigation. Store manager Wesley Ferris and his staff would have no reason to suspect that they were actually being set up for an armed robbery by escaped convicts. George's plan called for the group to steal specific items that would be most valuable for their continued survival as fugitives. As evening approached on Christmas Eve, the escapees made final preparations for their assault on Oshman's. They checked their weapons, reviewed their assignments, and confirmed their escape routes. Each man understood that this robbery would either provide them with the resources they needed for long-term freedom or result in their capture and return to prison. At approximately 6 p.m., as families across Irving sat down to Christmas Eve dinners and children waited excitedly for Santa's arrival, 6 armed and dangerous fugitives approached the Oshman's sporting goods store. Their plan was detailed. Their weapons were loaded, and their determination was absolute. They had no way of knowing that their actions in the next hour would trigger a massive manhunt and forever change the lives of countless innocent people. At exactly 6:20 p.m., the carefully choreographed deception began. George Rivas and Larry Harper approached the front entrance of the store with the confidence of legitimate security personnel. Their demeanor was professional and authoritative as they introduced themselves to the employees as Oshman's security guards investigating a theft ring that had been operating between multiple store locations. Wesley Ferris, the store manager, had no reason to question their credentials or their story. Security investigations were routine in retail environments, and the men appeared knowledgeable about company procedures and protocols. When they requested that all employees be gathered together to view photographs of suspected thieves, Ferris immediately complied with what seemed to be a reasonable request. As Ferris began assembling his staff in the store's break room, the other escapees entered through different entrances and began moving throughout the store. Joseph Garcia, Randy Halprin, Donald Newbury, and Michael Rodriguez spread out systematically, ostensibly assisting with the security investigation while actually positioning themselves to control all areas of the building. The employees noticed nothing unusual about the additional personnel. In their minds, they were participating in a routine security briefing that would help them identify potential thieves and protect store merchandise. The escapees' professional demeanor and apparent knowledge of security procedures maintained the illusion that this was a legitimate corporate investigation. George Rivas continued the deception as he spoke with the assembled employees, asking them to examine photographs and provide information about suspicious customers they might have observed. His calm, authoritative manner kept everyone focused on the supposed investigation, while his accomplices completed their positioning throughout the store. The moment of revelation came without warning. After ensuring that all employees were gathered in one location and all escape routes were secured, George Rivas drew his weapon and announced that they were being robbed. The transformation from security investigation to armed robbery was instantaneous and terrifying for the employees who suddenly realized they had been deceived. "This is a robbery," George declared, his voice calm but menacing. "Do exactly what we tell you and nobody will get hurt." The employees' shock was complete. What had begun as a routine security briefing had become a nightmare scenario with armed fugitives holding them at gunpoint. The escapees immediately began restraining the employees with materials they had brought specifically for this purpose. Rope, duct tape, and zip ties were used to bind the workers' hands and feet, ensuring they could not escape or interfere with the robbery. The efficiency and preparation demonstrated by the fugitives made it clear that this was not a spontaneous crime, but a carefully planned operation. Wesley Ferris found himself in the terrifying position of being forced to open the store's gun vault, safe, and cash registers while his employees were bound and helpless. George Rivas made it clear that any resistance would result in violence, repeatedly warning Ferris that he would be shot if he failed to cooperate fully. "Open everything," George commanded, pressing his weapon against Ferris's head. "The gun vault, the safe, the registers, everything. And don't even think about hitting any alarm buttons." The threat was clear and immediate, leaving Ferris no choice but to comply with every demand. As Ferris opened each secure area, the escapees methodically looted the store's most valuable contents. They took more than $70,000 in cash from the registers and safe, along with 44 firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Camping equipment, outdoor gear, and anything else that would be useful for their life as fugitives was loaded into stolen vehicles. The robbery was proceeding exactly according to George's plan when an unexpected complication arose. Misty Wright, the girlfriend of one of the store employees, was waiting in the parking lot for the store to close so she could pick up her boyfriend. When she looked through the store windows, she saw the employees with their hands raised above their heads and immediately sensed that something was wrong. Wright's observation of the situation inside the store represented the first crack in the escapees' perfect plan. Rather than continuing to wait in her car, she drove quickly to a nearby restaurant and called 911 to report suspicious activity at Oshman's. Her quick thinking and decisive action would set in motion the chain of events that would transform a robbery into a murder. George Rivas noticed Wright driving away rapidly and immediately warned his accomplices over their two-way radios. "We've been spotted," he announced. "Someone just drove off fast after looking in the windows. We need to move to the back of the store immediately." The escapees quickly modified their plan, abandoning their careful timetable in favor of a rapid exit through the loading dock. Outside, in the Ford Explorer, Patrick Murphy monitored police radio frequencies and soon heard the call that would change everything. A suspicious circumstance call was being dispatched to the Oshman's location, and patrol units were being directed to investigate. Murphy immediately radioed this information to his accomplices inside the store. "We've got company coming," Murphy warned. "Police are being dispatched here for suspicious activity. You need to get out now." The escapees began abandoning the store through the rear loading dock, carrying their stolen merchandise and weapons toward their getaway vehicles. Irving police officer Aubrey Hawkins was having Christmas Eve dinner with his family at an Olive Garden restaurant less than 1 mile from the Oshman's store when the dispatch came through on his radio. The call was classified as a suspicious circumstance rather than an armed robbery in progress, so Hawkins approached the scene with the level of caution appropriate for a routine investigation. At 6:29 p.m., Aubrey kissed his wife and son goodbye and left his family's Christmas Eve dinner to respond to the call. He drove his patrol car toward the Oshman store, unaware that 7 heavily armed fugitives were in the process of exiting the building with an arsenal of stolen weapons. Aubrey arrived at the scene within 3 minutes, approaching from the north entrance and driving through the parking lot toward the rear of the building. His methodical approach to investigating the scene demonstrated his professional training and commitment to thorough police work, even on routine calls. As Aubrey's patrol car rounded the corner to the loading dock area, he encountered the Texas 7 escapees at the worst possible moment. They were exiting the building with their stolen merchandise, heavily armed and desperate to avoid capture at any cost. The timing was catastrophic for everyone involved. Patrick Murphy, still monitoring police frequencies from his position in the parking lot, was the first to spot Aubrey's approaching patrol car. Police vehicle approaching the back of the building, he radioed to his accomplices. "1 unit, looks like he's coming right toward the loading dock." The warning came too late to prevent the confrontation, but it gave the escapees precious seconds to prepare for violence. George Rivas and his accomplices emerged from the building to find a police officer driving directly toward their position. With no time to retreat and no possibility of talking their way out of the situation, they made the decision that would transform them from escapees into murderers. The first gunshot shattered the Christmas Eve silence at 6:31 p.m., followed immediately by a devastating barrage of gunfire that would end Officer Aubrey Hawkins' life and launch the largest manhunt in Texas history. Multiple weapons fired simultaneously as the Texas 7 escapees unleashed their stolen arsenal on the unsuspecting police officer who had simply been doing his job. Aubrey Hawkins had no chance to defend himself, call for backup, or even understand what was happening. The attack was so sudden and overwhelming that he was killed almost instantly while still seated in his patrol car. The escapees fired 11 shots into his body using multiple weapons, ensuring that there would be no possibility of survival or testimony about their identities. In an act of final brutality that demonstrated their complete lack of humanity, the escapees pulled Aubrey's body from his patrol car and ran him over with their stolen SUV as they fled the scene. This unnecessary violence served no tactical purpose. It was simply the action of criminals who had abandoned any pretense of human decency in their desperation to escape. The sound of gunfire in the Oshman's parking lot was heard by witnesses throughout the area. But the brief duration of the attack meant that by the time anyone could respond, the Texas 7 were already fleeing the scene. They loaded their stolen merchandise into multiple vehicles and scattered in different directions, following escape routes they had planned in advance. Patrick Murphy, who had served as lookout during the robbery, joined the other escapees as they fled Irving with their stolen arsenal and approximately $70,000 in cash. The successful completion of the robbery had provided them with the resources they needed to remain fugitives for an extended period, but the murder of a police officer had transformed their situation dramatically. Within minutes of the shooting, Irving Police Headquarters erupted in activity as reports of an officer down reached the dispatcher. Every available unit was immediately dispatched to the Oshman's location, and alerts were sent to surrounding jurisdictions requesting assistance. The discovery of Aubrey's body confirmed everyone's worst fears. Detective Randall Johnson, who would become one of the lead investigators in the case, was working an off-duty job when he heard the radio traffic about the shooting. "I got a weird feeling in my stomach," Johnson later recalled. The loss of a fellow officer, particularly on Christmas Eve, created a sense of urgency and determination among law enforcement personnel throughout the region. The crime scene at Oshman's revealed the scope and sophistication of the robbery that had preceded Aubrey's murder. Store employees were found bound and traumatized, but alive in the break room, having witnessed the entire terrifying ordeal. Their statements provided investigators with detailed descriptions of the perpetrators and their methods of operation. Wesley Ferris, the store manager who had been forced to open the vault and registers, provided crucial information about the robbery's execution. His description of the suspects' professional demeanor and their claim to be security investigators demonstrated the level of planning and deception involved in the crime. The discovery that professional criminals had executed such an elaborate robbery suggested to investigators that they were dealing with experienced offenders rather than opportunistic thieves. The sophistication of the operation, combined with the level of violence used against Officer Hawkins, indicated that the perpetrators were extremely dangerous and likely to strike again. The Texas 7 had successfully completed their escape from the Irving area, but their problems were just beginning. The murder of a police officer had made them the subjects of an intensive manhunt that would involve hundreds of law enforcement personnel and span multiple states. Every highway patrol officer, sheriff's deputy, and police officer in Texas would be looking for them. The reward for information leading to their capture was quickly established at $100,000. An amount that would eventually grow to $500,000 as the manhunt intensified. This substantial reward meant that every citizen in Texas would be motivated to report suspicious activity or possible sightings of the fugitives. Within hours of the murder, photographs and descriptions of all 7 escapees were being distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. The FBI's 10 most wanted list would soon include multiple members of the group, and their case would become one of the most publicized manhunts in American history. The Texas 7 fled north from Irving in stolen vehicles loaded with their arsenal of weapons, stolen cash, and camping equipment. Their destination was Colorado, more than 800 miles away, chosen specifically because George Rivas believed law enforcement would expect them to head toward Mexico. The decision to go in the opposite direction from the Mexican border demonstrated George's strategic thinking and understanding of police psychology. The drive to Colorado was fraught with tension and danger. Every police car they encountered could potentially end their flight, and every traffic stop could result in a deadly shootout. The escapees monitored police radio frequencies constantly, listening for any indication that their location had been discovered or that roadblocks were being established ahead of them. During the journey, the escapees made several stops to switch vehicles and alter their appearances. They dyed their hair, grew beards and mustaches, and changed their clothing to avoid recognition. These physical changes, combined with their distance from Texas, would help them avoid detection during their time as fugitives. The group's first major purchase in Colorado was a 32-foot Pace Arrow recreational vehicle that would serve as their mobile headquarters for the next month. The RV provided them with comfortable living quarters, storage space for their weapons and stolen merchandise, and the mobility to relocate quickly if necessary. George paid cash for the vehicle, using money stolen from the Oshman's robbery. On January 1, 2001, the Texas 7 checked into the Coachlight RV Park in Woodland Park, Colorado, a small community located northwest of Colorado Springs near the U.S. Air Force Academy. They presented themselves to the park owner, Wayne Holder, as a group of traveling Christian missionaries doing religious work throughout the western United States. The choice of cover story was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Religious missionaries were common throughout the American West, and their presence would not attract undue attention from local residents or law enforcement. The story also explained why 7 men would be traveling together and living in close quarters without raising suspicions about their true relationship. To maintain their cover, the escapees played loud Christian music that could be heard by their neighbors, and even convinced one member to join a small Bible study group at the RV park. Larry Harper, with his military bearing and disciplined appearance, was particularly effective at portraying a dedicated missionary committed to spreading the gospel throughout Colorado. The escapees' behavior during their month in Colorado demonstrated their ability to blend into normal society when necessary. They frequented local bars and restaurants, shopped at grocery stores, and interacted with residents in ways that seemed completely normal. Their ability to appear as ordinary citizens was a testament to their intelligence and self-control. They even watched themselves featured on America's Most Wanted while sitting in local bars. The surreal experience of watching their own photographs on television while surrounded by unsuspecting citizens highlighted the boldness of their deception. Despite their successful integration into the Colorado community, the escapees remained heavily armed and prepared for violence if their cover was blown. Their RV contained numerous weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition, making them capable of engaging in sustained combat with law enforcement. They had essentially turned their recreational vehicle into a mobile arsenal. However, the reality of their situation was far different from their dreams. They were among the most wanted criminals in America, with hundreds of law enforcement officers searching for them daily. The $500,000 reward on their heads meant that any citizen who recognized them would have strong motivation to contact authorities. Money began to become a concern as well. While the $70,000 stolen from Oshman's was substantial, it was being depleted by the costs of maintaining 7 people in hiding. They needed to purchase food, fuel, and other necessities while also maintaining the RV and their weapons. The financial pressure added another source of stress to their already difficult life. Saturday night, January 20th, 2001, marked a turning point in the manhunt for the Texas 7 when America's Most Wanted aired its third segment about the escaped fugitives. The popular crime show, hosted by John Walsh, had become synonymous with bringing dangerous criminals to justice through public assistance and viewer tips. For the Texas 7, this broadcast would begin the final countdown to their capture. In the cozy confines of the Coachlight RV Park in Woodland Park, Colorado, Wayne Holder settled in to watch his regular Saturday night programming. As the owner of the RV park, Holder was familiar with all his guests and took pride in maintaining a safe, family-friendly environment. For 3 weeks, he had been hosting 7 men who claimed to be traveling Christian missionaries, and he had found them to be pleasant and well-behaved guests. One of the men, who went by the name Brother Jim, had even joined a small Bible study group that met regularly at the park. The group played loud Christian music that could be heard throughout their section of the campground, and they seemed genuinely committed to their religious mission. Holder had no reason to suspect that these men were anything other than what they claimed to be. As America's Most Wanted began its segment on the Texas 7, Holder watched with the casual interest of someone following a major news story. The program detailed the December 13th prison break, the Christmas Eve robbery and murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, and the ongoing manhunt for the 7 escapees. Photographs of each fugitive were displayed prominently as John Walsh described their crimes and the danger they posed to the public. When the photograph of Larry Harper appeared on screen, Holder felt a shock of recognition. The man shown on television bore a striking resemblance to Brother Jim, the religious missionary who had been living at his RV park for 3 weeks. The facial features, build, and general appearance were too similar to be coincidental. Holder's initial reaction was denial. The pleasant, well-mannered missionary who attended Bible study could not possibly be the same person as the violent escaped convict shown on television. However, as more photographs were displayed and additional details were provided about the fugitives, Holder's suspicions continued to grow. The program emphasized that the escapees were considered armed and extremely dangerous, capable of killing anyone who attempted to apprehend them. The murder of Officer Hawkins demonstrated their willingness to use lethal force against law enforcement, and authorities warned that any encounter with the fugitives could result in additional violence. As Holder continued watching, photographs of the other escapees were shown, and he began to recognize additional similarities to his current guests. The men living in the large RV had claimed to be 7 traveling missionaries, exactly the same number as the escaped convicts. Their arrival date at the park coincided with the timeline investigators had established for the fugitives' flight from Texas. Holder's concerns intensified as he recalled specific interactions with his guests. Their knowledge of religious topics seemed superficial, more like something learned quickly rather than developed through years of study and practice. Their behavior, while generally appropriate, occasionally seemed forced or unnatural, as if they were consciously playing roles rather than being themselves. The America's Most Wanted segment concluded with a reminder about the $500,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the Texas 7. John Walsh urged viewers to contact authorities immediately if they had any information about the fugitives' whereabouts, emphasizing that these men were extremely dangerous and should not be approached by civilians. After the program ended, Holder was unable to sleep. His suspicions had become too strong to ignore, but he also recognized the enormous implications of what he was considering. If his guests were indeed the Texas 7, his RV park was harboring some of the most wanted criminals in America. The safety of his other guests and his own family could be at risk. Holder spent the entire night wrestling with his concerns and trying to decide what action to take. He wanted to be certain of his suspicions before contacting law enforcement, but he also understood that any delay could allow the fugitives to escape if they suspected they had been recognized. On Sunday morning, January 21st, Holder made his decision. He contacted the Teller County Sheriff's Office and reported his suspicions about his guests. His call was taken seriously immediately, and investigators began working to verify his information and plan an appropriate response. Sheriff's deputies quickly obtained surveillance photographs from the RV park and compared them to the known images of the Texas 7. The similarities were unmistakable, confirming Holder's suspicions and providing law enforcement with their first solid lead in the case since the Christmas Eve murder. Federal authorities were notified immediately, and plans began for a coordinated operation to apprehend the fugitives. The challenge was enormous. 7 heavily armed and extremely dangerous men were living in a recreational vehicle surrounded by innocent civilians. Any attempt to arrest them could result in a deadly shootout that might harm bystanders. Throughout Sunday night and into Monday morning, a massive law enforcement operation had been coordinating the response to Wayne Holder's tip. The FBI, U.S. Marshals Service, El Paso County Sheriff's Office, Colorado State Patrol, and local police departments were all involved in planning the most dangerous arrest operation any of them had ever attempted. At approximately 11 a.m. on Monday, 3 of the escapees, George Rivas, Michael Rodriguez, and Joseph, left the RV park in a Jeep Cherokee and drove toward a nearby gas station. This movement provided the opportunity law enforcement had been waiting for to separate some of the fugitives from their heavily fortified base. A 12-man SWAT team moved into position around the gas station as the escapees completed their transaction and prepared to return to their vehicle. The tactical officers were heavily armed and prepared for the violent resistance they expected from men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill law enforcement personnel. As George Rivas walked toward the driver's side of the Jeep Cherokee, he found himself looking down the barrel of an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle held by a SWAT team member. The officer's weapon was pointed directly at George's chest, and he could see additional tactical officers positioned around the gas station with their weapons drawn. For a brief moment, George considered stepping on the accelerator and attempting to ram through the law enforcement cordon. His criminal instincts told him to fight rather than surrender, and he knew that capture meant certain death for his role in Officer Hawkins' murder. However, the overwhelming firepower arrayed against him made resistance futile. "I thought about hitting the gas," George later recalled in a television interview, "but I could see that they had us completely surrounded. There was no way out." The decision to surrender probably saved the lives of several law enforcement officers who were prepared for a deadly confrontation. The escapees were taken into custody without incident, marking the first successful arrests in the case since the Christmas Eve murder. However, 3 fugitives remained at large, still heavily armed and now aware that their location had been compromised. The most dangerous phase of the operation was yet to come. Back at the RV park, Larry Harper and Randy Halprin were inside their recreational vehicle when they heard about the arrests on a police scanner they had been using to monitor law enforcement communications. The news that 4 of their companions had been captured sent Harper into a panic that would have tragic consequences. Law enforcement teams surrounded the RV containing Harper and Halprin, using loudspeakers to demand their surrender. Randy Halprin, understanding that further resistance was pointless, emerged from the vehicle with his hands raised and surrendered peacefully to the officers. His decision to give up without a fight probably saved his life and avoided additional bloodshed. Larry Harper, however, remained inside the RV and refused to surrender despite repeated demands from law enforcement. His military training and psychological problems combined to create a dangerous situation where he saw only 2 options: fight or die. Given the overwhelming odds against him, Harper chose the latter. The sound of a single gunshot from inside the RV brought the standoff to a tragic end. When tactical officers finally entered the vehicle, they found Larry Harper dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. He had used one of their stolen weapons to end his own life rather than face capture and return to prison. Harper's suicide eliminated one of the remaining fugitives, but still left 2 escapees unaccounted for. Donald Newbury and Patrick Murphy had left the RV park in a van before the arrests began, and their whereabouts were unknown. The manhunt would continue until all 7 escapees were either captured or dead. The successful arrests at the RV park represented a major breakthrough in the case, but law enforcement officials knew that the operation was not complete until the final 2 fugitives were apprehended. Newbury and Murphy were still heavily armed and extremely dangerous, capable of killing anyone who attempted to capture them. The van used by Newbury and Murphy was discovered in the parking lot of a Holiday Inn in Colorado Springs, indicating that the 2 remaining fugitives had taken refuge in the hotel. This discovery set the stage for the final confrontation that would bring the Texas 7 case to its conclusion. The Holiday Inn represented a different tactical challenge than the RV park. The hotel was filled with innocent guests who could be taken hostage or used as human shields by the desperate fugitives. Any assault on their room could result in civilian casualties or a prolonged siege that might allow the escapees to escape. Sheriff's deputies and federal agents surrounded the Holiday Inn while negotiators attempted to establish contact with Newbury and Murphy. The 2 fugitives, trapped and facing certain capture, would soon be presented with the same choice that had faced their companions: surrender peacefully or die in a final confrontation with law enforcement. The events at Woodland Park had demonstrated both the effectiveness of America's Most Wanted in generating tips from the public and the dedication of law enforcement personnel in pursuing dangerous fugitives. However, the operation was not yet complete, and the final chapter of the Texas 7 story remained to be written. Around 10 p.m. on January 23rd, Colorado Springs police surrounded the Holiday Inn while SWAT teams and FBI agents moved into position around the building. The operation required careful coordination to ensure the safety of other hotel guests while preventing the escape of 2 heavily armed and extremely dangerous fugitives. Law enforcement faced a complex tactical situation. Intelligence suggested that Newbury and Murphy were well armed and prepared for a final confrontation. The hotel setting presented additional challenges, as any shootout could endanger innocent guests and employees throughout the building. Police began evacuating rooms adjacent to and near the fugitives' location while establishing a secure perimeter around the hotel. FBI Special Agent Mark Mershon led the operation, coordinating between multiple agencies to ensure a controlled response to what could easily escalate into a deadly siege. Rather than attempting an immediate assault on the room, negotiators established contact with Newbury and Murphy through the hotel's telephone system. The 2 fugitives, understanding their situation was hopeless, agreed to enter into discussions about the terms of their surrender. The negotiations continued throughout the night of January 23rd and into the early morning hours of January 24th. Newbury and Murphy made an unusual request as part of their surrender terms. They wanted the opportunity to speak publicly about conditions in Texas prisons and what they claimed were injustices in the state's criminal justice system. Law enforcement officials, eager to avoid bloodshed and end the manhunt peacefully, agreed to facilitate a live television interview as part of the surrender negotiations. KKTV anchor Eric Singer was contacted and agreed to conduct the interview, providing the fugitives with the platform they had requested. At approximately 5:45 a.m. ET on January 24, 2001, Patrick Murphy and Donald Newbury appeared on live television from their hotel room. Speaking calmly and at length, they discussed their views on Texas prison conditions and the circumstances that had led to their escape and subsequent crimes. During the televised interview, both men maintained that they had tried to harm as few people as possible during their escape, though this claim rang hollow given Officer Aubrey Hawkins' murder. They even thanked Colorado law enforcement for being very professional during the negotiations, a remarkable statement from fugitives who had spent over a month evading capture. The interview served its purpose as a face-saving gesture for the cornered fugitives. Having had their say on live television, Newbury and Murphy honored their agreement and prepared to surrender peacefully to authorities. Following the broadcast, The two men emerged from their hotel room with their hands raised above their heads, shirtless to demonstrate they carried no concealed weapons. FBI agents and SWAT team members took them into custody without incident, bringing the Texas 7 manhunt to its conclusion. They had their say by telephone, and then we had them back out of the room, shirtless, hands in the air, no weapons on them. FBI Special Agent Mershon reported to the media following the surrender. The peaceful resolution was fortunate for everyone involved, as a search of the hotel room revealed the extent of the fugitives' armament. Law enforcement officers discovered 10 loaded handguns and 2 loaded pump shotguns in the room, along with ammunition and other weapons stolen during their escape and subsequent crime spree. We went through the motel room with the FBI evidence response team, and there were 10 loaded handguns and 2 loaded pump shotguns. So they were ready, Agent Mershon explained. Following their surrender, Newbury and Murphy were transported to the Colorado Springs police station for initial questioning before being transferred to the custody of the El Paso County Sheriff. They were then held at the El Paso County Jail in Colorado Springs, while extradition proceedings began to return them to Texas to face capital murder charges. The peaceful surrender at the Holiday Inn marked the end of one of the most intensive manhunts in American history. The Texas 7, who had successfully executed the largest prison break in Texas history and evaded capture for over a month, were finally all accounted for. 6 would return to Texas to face trial for capital murder, while the 7th had chosen suicide over surrender. The manhunt lasted 41 days from the initial escape on December 13, 2000, to the final surrender on January 24, 2001. All 6 surviving escapees were charged with the capital murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins under Texas's Law of Parties statute, which holds all participants in a felony equally responsible for any deaths that occur during the commission of the crime. This meant that each man faced the possibility of execution, regardless of whether he had personally fired the shots that killed Officer Hawkins. The legal proceedings began with George Rivas, the acknowledged leader of the group, being the first to be brought to trial. Dallas County Assistant District Attorney Toby Shook, who would prosecute all the cases, understood the significance of securing a death sentence against the ringleader to establish precedent for the other trials. Shook's prosecution strategy was methodical and comprehensive. He presented evidence of the extensive planning that went into both the prison escape and the robbery, demonstrating that the escapees had acted with deliberate intent and full knowledge that their actions could result in death. The sophistication of their operation showed that these were not impulsive crimes, but carefully calculated acts of violence. The evidence against the Texas 7 was overwhelming. Store employees testified about the terror they experienced during the robbery, describing how the escapees had deceived them and then held them at gunpoint. Ballistics evidence linked multiple weapons to Officer Hawkins's murder, showing that several of the escapees had fired shots during the attack. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the escapees' own behavior following the murder. Rather than expressing remorse or attempting to turn themselves in, they had fled to Colorado and lived comfortable lives as fugitives for nearly a month. Their ability to enjoy themselves while Officer Hawkins' family grieved demonstrated a callous disregard for human life. The Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, became their final home, a stark, sterile facility designed to house the state's most dangerous criminals while they awaited execution. Death row in Texas is a world unto itself, where men live in solitary confinement for 22 hours a day, emerging only for showers, exercise, and visits. The psychological toll of such isolation, combined with the certainty of impending death, creates an environment where some inmates find religion, others lose their sanity, and a few, like the Texas 7, continue plotting until their final breath. Michael Rodriguez, the former restaurant owner who had orchestrated his wife's murder, became the first of the group to accept his fate. His 7.5 years on death row were marked by an unusual decision that would set him apart from his co-conspirators. He voluntarily dropped his appeals and requested execution. During his time at Polunsky, Rodriguez underwent what appeared to be a genuine religious conversion. He spent hours reading the Bible, attending chapel services, and counseling other inmates about faith and redemption. Guards described him as a model prisoner who caused no trouble and seemed genuinely remorseful for his crimes. The decision to forego appeals was not made lightly. Rodriguez spent months in consultation with attorneys and underwent multiple psychiatric evaluations to ensure he was mentally competent to make such a choice. In January 2007, a federal judge confirmed that Rodriguez understood the consequences of his decision and was mentally capable of waiving his right to appeal. "I need to pay back. I can't pay back monetarily. This is the way," Rodriguez told prison officials. His acceptance of responsibility extended beyond the Hawkins murder to the death of his wife Teresa, crimes that had haunted him for over a decade. The weeks leading up to Rodriguez's August 14, 2008 execution were filled with quiet preparation. He met regularly with a prison chaplain, wrote letters to family members, and arranged for his personal belongings to be distributed to other inmates. Unlike many death row inmates who become increasingly agitated as their execution approaches, Rodriguez seemed to find peace in his decision. His final meal request reflected simple tastes: spicy fried chicken breast, grilled pork steak with grilled onions, a bacon cheeseburger with everything, a fresh garden salad with French dressing, and French fries with ketchup. He ate the meal slowly, savoring each bite while discussing scripture with the chaplain, who had become his closest confidant. On the evening of August 14, 2008, Rodriguez was escorted to the death chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville. Outside, dozens of police officers stood at attention in honor of Officer Hawkins, while protesters held signs both supporting and opposing the death penalty. The tension was palpable as representatives from both the Hawkins and Sanchez families prepared to witness justice being served. Strapped to the gurney with intravenous lines inserted into both arms, Rodriguez was given the opportunity to make a final statement. His words, delivered while looking directly at the victims' family members, were profound in their simplicity and devastating in their honesty. "Yes, I do. I know this in no way makes up for all the pain and suffering I gave you. I am so sorry. My punishment is nothing compared to the pain and suffering I have caused. I hope that someday you can find peace. I am not strong enough to ask for forgiveness because I don't know if I am worthy. I realize what I've done to you and the pain I've given. Please, Lord, forgive me. I have done some horrible things. I ask the Lord to please forgive me. I have gained nothing, but just brought sorrow and pain to these wonderful people. I am sorry, so sorry. To the Sanchez family who showed me love and to the Hawkins family, I am sorry." As the lethal dose of sodium pentothal began flowing through the IV lines, Rodriguez continued praying in a whisper. "I'm ready to go, Lord," he said softly. His eyes closed peacefully, and 7 minutes later, at 6:20 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Rodriguez had become the first of the Texas Seven to pay the ultimate price for their crimes. George Rivas, the acknowledged leader of the group, spent nearly 11 years on death row, maintaining the same calculating intelligence that had made him such a dangerous criminal. Unlike Rodriguez's peaceful acceptance, Rivas continued fighting his conviction through every legal avenue available, while simultaneously preparing for what he increasingly viewed as his liberation from prison. During his time at Polunsky, Rivas displayed the same charismatic leadership that had attracted followers throughout his criminal career. He mentored younger inmates, organized study groups, and maintained extensive correspondence with supporters around the world. His intelligence remained sharp, and he continued developing elaborate plans, though now they focused on legal strategies rather than criminal enterprises. Rivas's most shocking decision came just before his execution, when he married Canadian woman Sherry McDonnell by proxy on February 29, 2012, the very day he was scheduled to die. McDonnell, who had corresponded with Rivas for years, claimed she loved him and wanted to be present for his final moments as his wife. The hasty marriage demonstrated Rivas's ability to manipulate people and situations even in his final hours. His attitude toward death was unique among condemned inmates. Rather than fearing execution, Rivas viewed it as freedom from the constraints of prison life. "I don't want to just exist anymore like an animal in prison," he once said. "What you call the death penalty, I call freedom. I can finally be free." This perspective reflected his lifelong inability to accept limitations or consequences for his actions. The psychological evaluations conducted during Rivas's time on death row revealed a complex individual who remained dangerous even in isolation. He claimed to have found religion and expressed regret about not finding Christ sooner. He also stated that he thought about Officer Hawkins frequently, especially during Christmas seasons, though the sincerity of this remorse remained questionable given his continued appeals and resistance to accepting full responsibility. In his final weeks, Rivas maintained his innocence regarding the planning and execution of the Hawkins murder, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. He continued to portray himself as a victim of an unjust system while showing little genuine remorse for the pain he had caused Officer Hawkins's family. On February 29, 2012, more than 24 police officers in uniform stood quietly outside the Huntsville prison during Rivas's execution. They walked in unison to stand behind the state criminal justice spokesman as he announced the death of the man who had orchestrated their colleague's murder over 11 years earlier. Rivas's final statement was brief but telling. "First of all, for the Aubrey Hawkins family, I do apologize for everything that happened. Not because I'm here, but for closure in your hearts. I really do believe you deserve that." The qualified nature of his apology, emphasizing that he was not sorry because he was about to die, revealed the calculating mind that had never truly accepted responsibility for his actions. As the lethal injection took effect, Rivas closed his eyes and showed no signs of distress. At 6:22 p.m., George Rivas was pronounced dead, ending the life of a criminal mastermind who had caused immeasurable pain to countless victims and their families. For Donald Newbury, he spent over 13 years on death row, the longest of any Texas 7 member at the time of his execution. His time at Polunsky was marked by continued legal challenges and an unwavering belief that the system had treated him unfairly, despite his extensive criminal history spanning nearly 3 decades. Newbury's psychological profile during his death row years revealed a man who remained fundamentally unchanged by his circumstances. He continued to blame others for his situation and showed little genuine remorse for his victims. His attitude toward Officer Hawkins's death was particularly troubling. He consistently argued that the officer's death could have been prevented with better police training. "I believe that if the street cops would have been trained better, this situation never would have occurred," Newbury stated during interviews. The officer should not have approached 7 armed individuals without waiting on backup. "It was obvious that we were all armed. It is tragic that it happened, but with longer training for rookies, it could have been prevented." This victim-blaming mentality extended to his view of his entire criminal career. Despite facing 99-year sentences for repeated armed robberies, Newbury maintained that his crimes were justified responses to an unfair system. "I had 99 years, he told the Associated Press. "What did I have to lose?" Newbury's legal appeals focused primarily on claims of ineffective counsel and inadequate funding for his defense. His attorneys argued that previous lawyers had been deficient and that courts had not provided adequate money for defense experts to illustrate how Newbury's abusive childhood had influenced his violent behavior. These appeals were consistently denied by both state and federal courts. The final years of Newbury's life were marked by increasing desperation as his execution date approached. He had been scheduled to die on February 1, 2012, but received a stay from the Supreme Court. His lawyers had argued that his execution should be delayed until a legal challenge in Arizona relating to better legal representation for death row inmates during initial appeals was resolved. Newbury's execution was finally rescheduled for February 4, 2015, after all appeals had been exhausted. In the weeks leading up to his death, he maintained his defiant attitude while also expressing what appeared to be genuine affection for his fellow inmates on death row. His final meal was simple but substantial, reflecting the practical nature that had characterized his criminal career. He spent his last day writing letters to friends and family, though few people remained in his life after decades of incarceration. As Newbury was taking his final breaths, the sound of revving engines from police officers could be heard inside the death chamber, a final tribute to the officer whose life he had helped destroy. Newbury's final statement was characteristically enigmatic and philosophical, that each new indignity defeats only the body, pampering the spirit with obscure merit. I love you all, that's it. Whatever meaning he intended to convey, the words offered no comfort to Officer Hawkins' family, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. As the lethal dose of pentobarbital took effect, Newbury closed his eyes and took a deep breath before beginning to snore. After about a dozen snores, each progressively quieter, he stopped all movement. He was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. on February 4, 2015, becoming the third Texas 7 member to be executed. Joseph Garcia spent nearly 15 years on death row, longer than any other executed member of the Texas 7. His time at Polunsky was marked by persistent legal challenges, claims of innocence regarding the actual shooting, and what appeared to be a genuine religious conversion that brought him peace in his final years. Garcia's case became a focal point for debates about Texas's law of parties statute, which allows defendants to be sentenced to death based upon the actions and intent of others if they participated in the underlying felony. Garcia's attorneys consistently argued that he had never fired his weapon at Officer Hawkins and had not intended for anyone to be killed during the robbery. Why am I here? Why am I on death row? I don't get it, Garcia said during a death row interview. Why are you trying to kill me for the actions of somebody else? This question became central to his appeals and sparked broader discussions about the fairness of executing accomplices who did not directly cause death. During his years on death row, Garcia underwent what appeared to be a genuine religious transformation. He spent hours studying scripture, participating in Bible study groups, and counseling other inmates about faith and redemption. Guards and chaplains noted his sincere commitment to his religious beliefs and his efforts to help other condemned men find peace. Garcia also used his time on death row to write a book about his experiences and to maintain relationships with his family members. Unlike some of his co-conspirators who became increasingly isolated, Garcia worked to repair damaged relationships and to find meaning in his remaining years. His legal team mounted extensive challenges to his conviction and sentence, focusing primarily on the constitutionality of the law of parties in capital cases. They argued that executing Garcia, who had not fired the fatal shots, violated the 8th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. These arguments were consistently rejected by state and federal courts. In the months leading up to his December 4, 2018 execution, Garcia's case attracted renewed attention from death penalty opponents and criminal justice reformers. His attorneys filed multiple last-minute appeals, including challenges to the source of Texas's lethal injection drugs and the composition of the parole board that had denied his clemency petition. Garcia spent his final weeks in prayer and reflection, expressing genuine remorse for the pain caused to Officer Hawkins' family, while maintaining his position that he should not be executed for crimes he did not directly commit. His final day was spent in quiet preparation, meeting with family members and his spiritual advisor. He declined to request a special final meal, instead accepting the standard prison fare served to all inmates. This decision reflected both his religious beliefs and his acceptance of his fate. Strapped to the gurney with IV lines inserted into both arms, Garcia was asked by the warden if he had any final words. His response was immediate and reflected both his religious faith and his continued belief in his own innocence. "Yes, sir. Dear Heavenly Father, please forgive them, for they know not what they do." The words, echoing Christ's statement from the cross, were delivered calmly and without apparent malice toward those who were about to end his life. He then paused for nearly a minute before speaking again as the muffled sound of motorcycle engines could be heard inside the death chamber. "To some of you," Garcia began, pausing again as the lethal dose of pentobarbital apparently began taking effect. He was unable to complete his final thoughts as consciousness slipped away. Garcia gasped 3 times and snored twice before all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:43 p.m., becoming the 4th and final Texas 7 member to be executed. His death came 13 minutes after the lethal injection began, marking the end of an 18-year legal journey that had cost taxpayers millions of dollars and provided some measure of closure to Officer Hawkins' family. The cases of the 2 remaining survivors, Randy Halprin and Patrick Murphy, became complicated by issues unrelated to their guilt or innocence. Murphy's execution was repeatedly delayed due to legal challenges related to his conversion to Buddhism while on death row and his request to have a Buddhist spiritual advisor present during his execution. Randy Halprin's case took an unexpected turn when allegations emerged that the judge who had presided over his trial, Vickers Cunningham, had made anti-Semitic comments about Halprin, who is Jewish. These allegations led to his execution being stayed while courts investigated whether he had received a fair trial. In November 2024, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Halprin a new trial based on findings that Judge Cunningham's anti-Semitic bias had violated Halprin's constitutional rights. The court's decision acknowledged that prejudice by a trial judge created such a high degree of antagonism as to make fair judgment impossible. The legal proceedings surrounding the Texas 7 cases established important precedents in Texas law regarding capital punishment, the law of parties, and judicial bias. The cases demonstrated both the thoroughness of the Texas criminal justice system and the challenges involved in prosecuting complex capital murder cases. Throughout the legal proceedings, Officer Hawkins' family maintained their dignity while advocating for justice. His widow, Lori, attended some of the early trials, but eventually stopped participating in the proceedings, finding the constant reminders of her husband's murder too painful to endure. The impact of Officer Hawkins' murder extended far beyond his immediate family to his fellow officers and the broader law enforcement community. His death served as a reminder of the dangers faced by police officers and the ultimate sacrifice that some make in the line of duty. Irving Police Department established several memorials to honor Officer Hawkins' memory, including naming a street in his honor and maintaining briefing chairs in the department's meeting room to remind officers of colleagues who would never again attend a briefing. These tributes ensure that his sacrifice will not be forgotten. The Texas 7 case also led to significant reforms in prison security and escape prevention procedures. The ease which 7 dangerous inmates had been able to overpower guards and escape from a maximum security facility prompted a comprehensive review of Texas Department of Criminal Justice policies and protocols. If this deep dive into the Texas 7 case has shown you anything, I hope it's that the truth behind these headlines is always more complex, more human, and more devastating than we first realize. Officer Aubrey Hawkins never made it home for Christmas dinner that night. Teresa Rodriguez never got to see her restaurant dreams fulfilled. Child carries the scars of Randy Halprin's violence to this day. These weren't just statistics. They were real people whose lives were cut short or forever altered by the choices of 7 men who decided their freedom mattered more than innocent lives. This is exactly why No Way Out exists. To go beyond the surface, to examine not just what happened, but how and why it happened. To honor the victims by telling their complete stories, not just the parts that make headlines. If you found value in this comprehensive breakdown, if you learned something new about this case, or if it made you think differently about crime, justice, or the choices that define us, I'd appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. More importantly, I want to hear your thoughts. What struck you most about this case? What questions do you still have? What cases would you like to see covered with this same level of depth and respect? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who's interested in true crime that goes deeper than the sensational, someone who wants to understand the real human cost behind these stories, share this video with them. Remember, every choice we make ripples outward. affecting lives we may never even know about. The Texas Seven made their choices. Officer Hawkins made his. Wayne Holder made his when he picked up that phone to call the authorities. We all face moments where we have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right, between looking the other way and speaking up, between serving ourselves and serving something larger. Your choices matter. Until next time, this is No Way Out, where true crime meets truth.